This is the story of the most expensive miscalculation in modern history. Not a misread map or a failed battle plan, but a fundamental error about what kind of country America was, an error that cost Japan everything. By 1941, Japan's military leadership understood American power in raw numbers. They knew the United States had more steel, more oil, more factories, more people. The intelligence was never the problem. Admiral Yamamoto, who had lived in America and studied at Harvard, had seen Detroit's assembly lines and the oil fields of Texas with his own eyes. He told his superiors plainly that in a long war, Japan could not win. So if they knew all of this, if the numbers were never in doubt, why did they attack anyway? Because Japan's leaders had convinced themselves of something the numbers couldn't measure. They believed that America, for all its wealth, was soft. A sprawling, divided democracy, distracted by consumer comforts and isolationist politics, with no stomach for a long and bloody war in a distant ocean. Strike hard enough at Pearl Harbor, the thinking went, and a shocked, demoralized America would rather negotiate than bleed. That was the misjudgment. Not the size of America's factories, but the question of whether Americans would ever have the will to use them. And the answer to that question would be written in steel, in fire, and in the wreckage of an empire that bet its existence on getting it wrong. To understand the misjudgment, you have to understand where it came from. Because Japan's leaders didn't pull the idea of a soft America out of thin air. They had what they believed was evidence. Through the 1930s, Japanese diplomats and military attaches watched the United States and saw a nation that seemed to want nothing to do with the world's troubles. They saw the Neutrality Acts, passed by a Congress determined to keep America out of foreign wars. They saw America First rallies fill stadiums. They saw a country still climbing out of the Great Depression, where unemployment lines felt more urgent than events in Manchuria or Poland. And they drew a conclusion that felt logical. A democracy, they reasoned, is a slave to public opinion. Its leaders can't act without the consent of the governed, and the governed clearly wanted peace. A dictatorship could demand sacrifice, but could a nation of shopkeepers and farmers be made to bleed for islands most Americans couldn't find on a map? There was a cultural dimension to this too, and it ran deep. Japan's warrior ethos prized spirit over material, the belief that disciplined will could overcome superior resources. Many in the high command genuinely believed that Japanese fighting spirit was a force that American industrial wealth simply could not match. To them, a nation that valued comfort and individualism above sacrifice wasn't just materially beatable, it was spiritually weak. So the plan that emerged wasn't reckless in their eyes. It was a gamble built on a theory of the enemy's character. Cripple the Pacific Fleet, seize the resource-rich territories of the South, build an impregnable defensive perimeter, and present America with a situation so costly to reverse that a war-weary, comfort-loving public would push its leaders toward the negotiating table. They weren't planning to defeat the United States. They were planning to convince it that the fight wasn't worth it. Everything depended on America behaving the way Japan expected. It would not. On the morning of December 7th, 1941, Japan executed its plan almost perfectly. Battleships burned at their moorings. Nearly 2,400 Americans died in a matter of hours. By the cold logic of the gamble, this was the moment America was supposed to flinch. It did the opposite. The attack that was meant to break America's will instead forged it into something Japan had never accounted for. The isolationism that Japanese planners had watched so carefully evaporated almost overnight. The America First movement, millions strong on December 6th, was politically dead by December 8th. A country that had argued bitterly over whether to even arm itself now spoke with a single voice. Pearl Harbor didn't demoralize America. It united it, and it made the war personal in a way no negotiated settlement could ever undo. That was the first crack in the theory. Japan had read American division as weakness, but division in a democracy isn't the same as fragility. It's simply what a free people sound like when the stakes are low. Raise the stakes high enough, and that same noisy, quarreling public could close ranks with terrifying speed. And then came the part of the equation Japan had dismissed entirely: the factories. The very industrial base that Yamamoto had warned about now turned toward war with a ferocity that defied every assumption about a comfort-loving people. Automobile plants stopped making cars and started making tanks and aircraft. Shipyards began launching vessels not in years, but in weeks. The American worker, the supposedly soft consumer who would never sacrifice, went to the factory floor in numbers, and with an intensity that stunned observers around the world. Japan had bet that America had the steel, but not the spirit. Within months of Pearl Harbor, it was becoming horrifyingly clear that America had both. The will Japan assumed was absent wasn't only present, it was now fused to the largest industrial machine on Earth, and it was pointed directly at them. Numbers tell the rest of the story, and they are merciless. Consider the aircraft carrier, the weapon that decided the Pacific. Japan had stunned the world with its carrier force at Pearl Harbor, but over the course of the war, Japan managed to complete roughly a dozen fleet and light carriers. The United States built more than 100 carriers of all types, not a slight edge, an ocean of them. The pattern repeated everywhere you looked. America outproduced Japan in aircraft by a margin of nearly 4-1, building roughly 300,000 planes during the war. In merchant shipping, the gap became almost comical. American shipyards perfected the Liberty ship, eventually assembling these vessels in a matter of days. Japan couldn't sink them faster than America could launch them. And here's the detail that captures the entire misjudgment. After Pearl Harbor, Japan never recovered the initiative for long, because every loss America suffered could be replaced, and every loss Japan suffered could not. When the United States lost carriers at Coral Sea and elsewhere, new hulls were already sliding down the ways. When Japan lost 4 carriers in a single morning at Midway in 1942, it lost something it could never rebuild at the same pace, not just the ships, but the trained crews and pilots that took years to create. This was the cruel arithmetic Yamamoto had foreseen, and his superiors had chosen to ignore. The war didn't become a contest of courage or tactics, though there was no shortage of either. It became a contest of replacement rates, and in that contest, the side with the bigger factories and the will to run them around the clock would grind the other into the sea. Japan hadn't lost because its soldiers lacked spirit. They had spirit in abundance, often to the bitter and tragic end. Japan lost because its leaders had built an entire war on the belief that spirit could substitute for steel, and that the enemy possessed steel without spirit. Both halves of that belief were wrong. In the end, the misjudgment wasn't about America at all. It was about the limits of a worldview. Japan's leaders had looked at the United States and seen what their own assumptions allowed them to see: a wealthy, divided, comfort-loving democracy that would never pay the price of a long war. They mistook openness for weakness, debate for division, and peace for cowardice. They couldn't imagine that a free people, once roused, might fight with a unity and fury that no dictatorship could command, and that they would fuse that fury to the greatest industrial engine the world had ever built. The tragedy is that the warning came from inside their own ranks. Yamamoto had seen America with his own eyes and told them the truth. But intelligence is only as good as the willingness to believe it. And Japan's high command preferred a theory of the enemy that flattered their own values over the facts a man had laid before them. They didn't lack information. They lacked the humility to accept what it meant. By the time the lesson was fully learned, it was written in the ashes of Japanese cities and the wreckage of an empire that had spanned the Pacific. The country that bet America lacked the will to fight had, in the end, taught America exactly how far that will could go. It's the oldest mistake in the history of conflict, and Japan made it on the largest possible scale. They didn't lose because they misjudged America's strength. They lost because they misjudged its heart.